Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is Dr. Brian Matthew Jordan. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you for having me, Daz. Pleasure to be here.
And in this episode, we are going to be discussing the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, which took place on April the 14th, 1865. And of course, it is 160th anniversary of those events this year. Okay, Brian, let's start with a little bit of background. Why would somebody want to murder Abraham Lincoln?
Well, it's a great question. Lincoln's assassin was a 26-year-old white supremacist Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. Booth had actually first conspired to kidnap President Lincoln, hatched a kidnap plot that he hoped would create a hostage-like situation. He hoped to kidnap the president so as to facilitate the exchange of Confederate prisoners who were held at Point Lookout in Maryland. This was in March of 1865. That kidnap plot was foiled by a last-minute change in Lincoln's plans. And at some point over the spring, right, the kidnap plot turns to murder. And historians still debate the exact moment when the kidnap plot becomes a murder plot. But most of us agree that there is one pivotal moment, and that's April the 11th, 1865. It turns out to be Abraham Lincoln's very final public speech. It's just, of course, 2 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Lincoln is addressing a serenade at the Executive Mansion, a serenade that's come to demand really sort of a victory speech. Lincoln is going to disappoint the crowd. He's not ready to take a victory lap. He reminds everyone in attendance that the questions of Reconstruction are now pressed upon the nation. And he understands rather keenly. Not only is the war not yet over, but once we get to that point where the war is over, right, the challenges of Reconstruction, the questions of how do you reunite this nation, how do you ensure freedom for formerly enslaved persons, all of these questions are going to be put on the nation's agenda. So that's what he's talking about on April the 11th, 1865. John Wilkes Booth is in attendance. He is in the crowd that evening. And Lincoln turns most of his attention in that speech to his embryonic plans for Reconstruction in Louisiana as one of the laboratories for his wartime Reconstruction. He makes history in this April 11th speech by announcing publicly what he's only yet told privately to Louisiana's Unionist Governor Michael Hahn, that it's time to think about a very limited African American suffrage, that it's time to extend voting rights to literate African Americans and to African American Union veterans in Louisiana as a way to ensure sort of a bedrock of loyalty in this post-war state of Louisiana. And it's a remarkable utterance, Daz, because this is the first time that an American president, a sitting American president, has uttered support for suffrage rights, voting rights for anyone other than white males. And you think about Lincoln being president 16, right? I mean, president 15 had been inaugurated with the Chief Justice whispering the news of the Dred Scott decision to him on the inaugural platform. Just one president later, right? Lincoln is saying not only do black men have rights that we should respect, but they should be voting. Lincoln's announcement of this, John Wilkes Booth, Confederate sympathizer, white supremacist, hears these words, and he says, he turns to, has two friends with him in the audience that evening. He says, "This means Negro citizenship," only he uses, of course, a different word. "This means Negro citizenship. For that, I will put him through." And 3 nights later, 5 blocks away, 10th and F, Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth makes good on that promise. And kidnap plot becomes now murder conspiracy. And it's not just to take out, right, Abraham Lincoln. He had assembled, going back to the kidnap plot, this misanthropic band of conspirators who he now hoped would decapitate the federal government. And there they are on the screen, right? They meet at Mary Surratt's boarding house on H Street in Washington. It's in the Chinatown section of Washington today, still stands. It's a very good Chinese restaurant called the Walk and Roll. So you can go have an egg roll at Mary Surratt's boarding house, the nest where the egg was hatched, as Andrew Johnson said. But Mary Surratt is there. She's the owner of the boarding house. So where they're going to have the meetings to hatch first the kidnap plot, and then as things turn to the murder plot, right, these same folks are going to be involved. George Atzerodt from Port Tobacco, Maryland, an immigrant. He is going to be assigned the task of murdering the vice president, the newly inaugurated vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was still living in the Kirkwood House Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, had been sworn in, of course. We're just 6 weeks into Lincoln's second term. People forget that. So Atzerodt was to kill Andrew Johnson. Lewis Payne, who also went by the name of Lewis Powell. He had been a soldier in the 2nd Florida, was wounded on the second day at Gettysburg, finds his way into a Baltimore hospital, and there comes into Booth's orbit. He is assigned the task of murdering the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward. And then there's other folks, right, in the plot who will help to facilitate the escape. And of course, Booth, ever the actor, is going to save the lead role for himself, killing the president. He also believes that Ulysses S. Grant, freshly arrived from Appomattox, is going to be in attendance at the play that evening at Ford's Theater. So he thinks that he has an opportunity to take out not only the president, but the general in chief. So think about it, right? If Booth's plan is successful, you'll have the president, the general in chief, the vice president, and the secretary of state all murdered 5 days after Appomattox. And this at a moment, right, in the 19th century when there is no constitutional amendment providing a presidential line of succession. You would be thrust into a constitutional crisis where there is no clear successor, right? It had only just been kind of gnawingly established that the vice president becomes president in the event of the president's incapacity. So you'll be in constitutional crisis mode. That's exactly what Booth wants. An opportunity, right, with large Confederate field armies still in the field, with folks still thinking about, right, perhaps the guerrilla option, right? Jefferson Davis thinking about that. Others thinking about resuscitating the war by joining forces with Maximilian's forces in Mexico, right? Is this a way to resuscitate the Confederacy? Booth doesn't think about this as the last shot of the Civil War. He thinks about this as the first pistol crack of at least a Confederate counter-revolution, or maybe the war's second act.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And yes, so I want to take you back just a little bit. So was there what were the plans for the kidnap, and were they made available to see and study, and what was going to go into that kidnap, and would some of these were they going to be involved in that kidnap plot?
Yes. So the kidnap plot was actually to unfold on March the 17th, 1865. And Booth at this time, right, he is a very successful actor, earning about $650 per week by the midpoint of the Civil War. Performs in DC, in Baltimore, and Richmond. He's an itinerant. He's living at the National Hotel in Washington at this point. And he has connections, right, to the Confederate underground. He's made several visits in the summer of 1864 to Montreal, which was kind of a nest of the Confederate underground. He has been put into contact with various Confederate agents in Maryland, in suburban Maryland. Confederate underground operatives put him in touch with um, Samuel Alexander Mudd, a Confederate sympathizing doctor and enslaver who lives in Charles County, Maryland. Mudd brings John Harrison Surratt, who is a Confederate agent, into the plot. That's Mary Surratt's son. Um, and he establishes this whole network of Confederate folks who would kind of help him whisk the president after he's captured away through um, southern Maryland. The plan, the kidnap plot, is to gather together some of these conspirators, overtake the president's carriage. He learns, right? Lincoln's notoriously lax about his security. His schedule is pretty much public. He learns that Lincoln is planning to attend a performance of Tom Taylor's play, Still the Waters Run, at the Campbell General Hospital in the northern part of Washington, D.C. So the plan is Lincoln's taking the carriage ride out to the Campbell General Hospital on March the 17th, 1865, to overtake the carriage, kidnap the president, and then haul him away, hold him as a hostage, and ensure that there can be a release of prisoners of war, Confederates captured by Federals on the battlefield. Captive prisoners who are being held at Point Lookout in Maryland, and this is obviously to remedy what has by this point in the war become a Confederate manpower crisis. Right, Lee's army bleeding on average 90 deserters every day on the Petersburg siege lines by the spring of 1865. We're at a mobilization in the Confederate South that's nearly 3/4 of white military age males. There's a manpower crisis in the Confederacy, and it's been exacerbated by the fact that the prisoner exchange process has broken down. Right. In 1862, we'd had the Dix Hill cartel, which had facilitated a prisoner exchange process, kind of a schedule of ranks that allowed 40 privates to be exchanged for every captured major general, to facilitate this movement of prisoners back and forth, and to ensure that the prison camps weren't becoming a logistical encumbrance on either army. That cartel breaks down, as you know, in 1863. And it's largely over the issue of race. The Bureau of Colored Troops begins actively recruiting and enlisting African American soldiers in the Union armies. As you know, 10% of the Union armies and navies are comprised of African American soldiers, both formerly enslaved and free blacks, 189,000 men. And the Confederates have made it very clear what their position is on black soldiers. That black soldiers should be treated as fugitives. The white officers who lead those black regiments should be charged with leading a servile insurrection, and that there's going to be no quarter. for African American soldiers, that they are going to be summarily executed. And of course, uh, by the spring of 1864, you have incidents like Fort Pillow and Poison Spring, Plymouth, North Carolina, Alusty, racial atrocities on a large scale. And it's largely in response to Fort Pillow in particular, which becomes the most notorious episode of racial atrocity, that the federal government decides, well, fine, if you're going to be executing black soldiers and you're not going to accord them the protections of the Lieber Code, of the Dix-Hale Cartel, then we're going to cease all prisoner exchanges. And prisoner exchanges are halted in April of 1864. The prison camps swell in size and population and atrocity. You get the overcrowding and the ill provisioning at places like Andersonville and Elmira. Um, and the Confederates are desperate for manpower, right? And so Booth turns to this kidnap plot as a way to force the federal government's hand to resume prisoner exchanges, and to broker a new phase of the war. And some of these very folks who are involved in the kidnap plot and who he has identified as owning key properties on his desired escape route, right? They then become reanimated in the assassination. They're going to be some of the same folks that will whisk him along on his escape from Ford's Theater. Key there is Samuel Alexander Mudd, right, who is be a great controversy over the extent to which was this just a friendly country doctor who was abiding by his Hippocratic oath and setting Booth's fractured fibula, or was he more deeply involved? And of course, Dr. Mudd's case becomes harder to argue when you realize he'd met with Booth at least 3 times. He'd been involved in the kidnap plot. He'd brought Surratt into the conspiracy. Very implausible to believe that he didn't recognize Booth and Davy Harold when they arrived at his farm that evening. And he's given sanctuary that night, and then goes on the rest of his way into the pine thickets of Maryland as he escapes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to bring up a really interesting picture now. And again, this is going back a little bit, but this is to the second inauguration. And I
Yeah,
understand that Booth was actually in the crowd, wasn't he?
he sure was. Yeah, absolutely. So Booth had been sort of, for lack of a better word, stalking the president in the spring of '64. He became obsessed with Lincoln, and that there are a number of occasions where they are crossing paths, and um, we could have had in that moment, right, the soaring rhetoric of the second inaugural. It's hard to conceive that he is there, and maybe this is one of those moments that again leads him along the path to ultimately the murder plot.
Mhm. Okay, let's bring up, like you said, the Ford's Theatre itself, and so his connection to that, meaning Booth's. Obviously, you said he was an actor, so from what I understand, he worked there, didn't he, as an actor? So he had the connections there, and so when he finds out Lincoln's coming here, he must be overjoyed.
He absolutely is. Ford's Theater was at 10th and F in Washington, D.C. Again, about 6 blocks from the White House. It was a relatively new theater. John Ford had opened the theater at the outset of the war. Lincoln, of course, as you know, was a great lover of the theater. He had actually seen the Booth family in stage performances before. John Wilkes came from he was in the family business. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was one of the most famous Shakespearean actors of his day. His brother, Edwin Booth, was widely regarded as the 19th century's greatest Hamlet. Uh, John Wilkes Probably didn't. I think most historians agree. Probably didn't have the natural talent of either his father Junius or brother Edwin, but again, he was successful enough to make a go of acting during the Civil War, earning as much as $650 per week by the midpoint of the war. So, not an insignificant sum, widely known. Again, kind of an itinerant, and knew John Ford, knew the layout of the theater. Was there, in fact, as John Ford was printing up handbills announcing a special benefit performance of the three-act play Our American Cousin. It was to star Laura Keene, and uh, John Ford was thrilled, right, in this moment, the same very week of the surrender at Appomattox, serenades all the way through Washington D.C., people celebrating what they think is the end of the war. Uh, Ford is, looking to drum up some business. Here's a special benefit performance. The president's going to be in attendance. Again, he believes that Grant is going to be in attendance that evening. So this is where, right, Booth learns of his opportunity. He'd been looking for the opportunity uh, to enact this murder plot. Um, so he knows the layout of the theater. He is then going to make his way to Mary Surratt's boarding house, again, not terribly far from Ford's. Makes arrangements with Mary Surratt to have a pair of field glasses and some shooting irons taken out to her Maryland property, what is today Surrattsville, Maryland. So she is involved in the process of helping to facilitate his escape. And then he is going to call the rest of the conspirators, right? Add Surratt, Powell, into the plot to, on this Good Friday evening, April 14th, 1865, put this plot to decapitate the federal government into action. Um, he spends earlier part of that day, April the 14th, right, uh, preparing his stage, if you will. Takes an old music stand and uses that as a door prop to ensure that after he has committed his dastardly act with the 44 caliber Derringer, that he'll be able to jam the door to the presidential box shut. He kind of scopes out his escape, right? Is going to arrange for a hapless stagehand named Joseph Burroughs to hold his horse in the back alley, which is known as Baptist Alley. Ford's Theater is actually in an old converted Baptist church, and sets the stage, if you will, quite literally for this act. And of course, being a great actor, he has a sense of drama. He also knows the play, and he knows that the great laugh line of the play comes in Act Three, Scene Two, when the eponymous character is asked, right, "Don't you know the manners of good society, eh?" And the great laugh line of the play is when that eponymous character is called an old sockdologizing old man trap. Uh, Booth knows that those words are going to send the audience into a riotous laughter, and that's the moment at which he is going to squeeze the trigger of that 44 caliber Derringer at the back of Lincoln's head. He's wielding a Bowie knife in his other hand, which he'll slash at the other members of the presidential party, and then leaps from that presidential box down to the stage, a distance of about 12 feet. And as he leaps, right, the spur on the back of his boot catches the old Treasury Guard flag, that John Ford had draped to kind of prepare for the president's visit. And it results in him landing on the stage rather awkwardly. He's going to fracture his fibula. And he's in great pain as he leaps across the stage and raises that bloodied Bowie knife into the air, screaming, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the motto of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Leaps across the stage and then back into the alley where Burroughs had been holding the horse, and makes his way through the alleys of Washington, across the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland, and then on to 12 days as a fugitive. Right, folks in the theater at first, right? I mean, they think that this is some sort of bizarre improvisation into the play. And then they hear the blood-curdling screams of Mary Lincoln, of Clara Harris, the daughter of New York's Senator Ira Harris, who was actually joined the president with her fiance, Major Henry Rathbone. Grant, of course, had kind of famously turned down President Lincoln's invitation to join him that evening, so he was spared being a witness to this tragedy. Rathbone and Harris are there with him. Rathbone is going to be slashed by Booth's knife. They hear the screams from the presidential box, and then suddenly they realize this was no improvisation in the play. There's a call for medical help. Two doctors are actually in the audience, Dr. Charles Leal and Dr. Charles Taft. They make their way to the presidential box, inspect examine the president, and determine that it's a very, very serious injury, and they believe that it's likely to be fatal. And so then they start to look for truly a place for the president to die. They carry his body from the box through the dress circle of the theater, wind their way through a panic-stricken crowd out into 10th Street. Initial plan may have been to take the president's body to the saloon next door. Suggestion is made that that's not a dignified place for a president to die. So they're standing in the middle of 10th Street on this evening of April the 14th. And the boarding house that's on the screen, standing in that doorway of that boarding house, is a young tenant named Willie Clark, who had fought in the 13th Massachusetts, Union veteran. Willie Clark hears the commotion, and he begins waving to those carrying the president's body. Bring them over here. Bring him over here, he says. Bring him over here. And so they move over to the Petersen boarding house, into Willie Clark's rented room, back into that boarding house, and they splay Lincoln's 6'4" frame across Willie Clark's wooden spindle bed. They have to lay him diagonally because he's much too tall for that bed. And the death watch begins, right? And folks begin to crowd into Willie Clark's room. The front parlor of the Petersen House really becomes sort of the nerve center of the federal government, of a manhunt, a federal manhunt for Lincoln's killer. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton really takes charge at that moment and begins to issue the reward, $100,000 reward, but to begin collecting the testimony, to begin collecting eyewitness evidence. Right. Another Union veteran, James Tanner, from the 87th New York, lost both of his legs in battle at Second Bull Run. he is going to be called from a neighboring boarding house to come and serve as the official government stenographer. And he is the one that records some of the first eyewitness testimony. And of course, because Booth is so well known, because he's such a famous actor, he can be identified almost immediately as the assassin. So James Tanner, legless James Tanner, Corporal Tanner, is there collecting this evidence in the front parlor as folks are beginning to arrive to be at Lincoln's bedside as his breathing grows more labored, and finally, of course, 7:22 a.m. the next morning, April the 15th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln is going to breathe his last, succumbs to that bullet wound, and the next morning, April the 15th, 1865, about noon, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Salmon Chase, is going to swear Andrew Johnson in as the 17th president of the United States. Had been vice president for just 6 weeks. And, folks, at least at first, believe, right, that some of the radical Republicans, I find this, amazing. They're kind of whispering to themselves, maybe Booth's bullet was providential. Lincoln had been making overtures, of course, famously in that second inaugural address that Booth had heard. It's time to bind up the nation's wounds. It sounded to a lot of radicals. Of course, they remembered the debates over wartime Reconstruction. They remembered Lincoln's pocket veto of the Wade Davis bill. They wondered if maybe Lincoln was the man for the war, but he's not the man for the peace. Andrew Johnson, on the other hand, right, guy who declares that he wants to make treason odious, that he would be the Moses of the free people. They say maybe this is truly a providential moment, and the radicals are initially, right, kind of quietly excited about the possibilities of Johnson's presidency, until, of course, Andrew Johnson turns out to be anything but the radicals' dream, and turns out to take Reconstruction in a rather different course.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I want to jump back as well to the fact that, like you said, there was attempts on Seward's life and
Yes.
Johnson's life as well. So tell us about what happened to these guys.
Yes. So George Atzerodt, from Port Tobacco, Maryland, he was the conspirator who was assigned the task of killing the vice president. And Johnson is, again, in his room that evening at the Kirkwood House Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue at 12th and Pennsylvania, blissfully unaware that he is the target of a murder plot. Atzerodt loses his courage and actually spends the night guzzling away some whiskey in a Washington bar, and then decides not to make the attempt on Johnson's life. So he will later be apprehended, and he is one of the 4 conspirators to be sentenced to death by hanging. And he will be executed, Atzerodt will, on July the 7th, 1865. The old Federal Arsenal. The attack on Seward does happen. Lewis Payne, or Lewis Powell, again, he goes by the alias Payne, is going to disguise himself as a pharmacist. This is going to be the ruse that he uses to gain access to Seward's townhouse, which is in Lafayette Park, across the street from the White House. Seward actually, a couple weeks before this, had a carriage spill. It's a pretty nasty carriage spill. left him in this cumbersome neck brace, which ironically enough is going to turn out to save his life. Um, so he's bedridden at this point. He had been communicating, of course, with Abraham Lincoln, who at this point, at the time of the accident, was down at City Point on the Petersburg siege lines. Lincoln was so eager to be at the front of the action. He knew that the war was coming quickly to an end, at least in the Eastern Theater. Seward had been in communication even while bedridden with Lincoln. He was trying to get Lincoln to lift the blockade as a signal too that the war was coming to an end. Lincoln learns about Seward's carriage spill and very nearly returned to Washington, right upon receipt of that news. But Seward's bedridden. Lewis Powell, alias Payne, is going to uh, disguise himself as a pharmacist, delivering medicine to the Seward house to gain access, and he does, right. Slashes his way to the second floor bedroom where the Secretary of State is located, and begins to savagely slash him with a knife. Of course, he can't get through the neck brace, but he leaves permanent scars. Seward will have scars on his cheek the rest of his life. It's a very, very bloody attack, but ultimately is going to flee the Seward house without having killed the Secretary of State. But this touches off panic because Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of War Stanton, right? They're trying to piece together what is happening here, and they learn of this attack, right? They eventually will learn of the foiled attack on Johnson, and it touches off this fear that this is truly a conspiracy, and at least at first there's a fear that the Confederate underground is involved, right? And at the time, and even in later historiography, right, there will be this persistent question, to what extent was the Confederate underground involved? Uh, was the Confederate Secret Service involved? Was this retribution? Some would argue for the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid that attempted to kidnap Jeff Davis. Was this the Confederacy's retribution? A couple of professional historians in the latter part of the 20th century, Bill Tidwell and others, would advance this theory. I think the consensus of the professional historiography is that Booth had connections to the Confederate underground, but there has been no smoking gun, right, linking the high-ranking Confederate authorities to this, as much as the bloodthirsty radicals in this immediate moment wanted to see that connection, as much as later historians have wanted to make that case. Others honing in on figures like Judah Benjamin and others. So I think it's enough to say that it is a conspiracy, right? Booth assembles a conspiracy. He has connections to Montreal. But to claim that the Confederate High Command is directly involved, right? I think is sort of a step too far.
Excellent. I really enjoyed listening to that. And also, there, like you said, that Confederate underground, there could have even been links to the cotton traders in Liverpool, and
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
conspiracy that I've heard. Okay, before we talk about the hunt for Booth,
Yes.
I'd just like to bring up how shocked
Uh-huh.
is the nation of this assassination.
Yes. This is obviously the first presidential assassination, and if you think about the whiplash, right? Palm Sunday, you get Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Good Friday, Lincoln's assassination. And people now wondering what they were wondering aloud at Appomattox. Is Appomattox the beginning of the end, or is it merely a signal of halftime? Right? Is this now going to resuscitate the war? Of course, you've got the largest Confederate field army, still not yet surrendered. That surrender, as you know, doesn't take place until April 26th at Bennett Place. You still have Richard Taylor, Edmund Kirby Smith, Stan Wadey, all these folks who are out there. Again, some Confederate designs, not all that far-fetched, of joining with the puppet emperor in Mexico and reinaugurating the war. Um, you've got, and Sherman fears this, and it actually figures into his surrender negotiations with Joe Johnston. Sherman fearing that he won't be able to restrain his men. Right? Union soldiers still actively in the field in the Western Theater, saying that they're not going to take quarter anymore. They believe that the Confederates are behind this, and they are out for vengeance. Those Union soldiers still in the field. So you have a whole spectrum of responses. Calls for vengeance, calls for outright retribution, calls to reanimate the war. Um, you have African Americans, of course, who I love Frederick Douglass's phrase here. He calls the assassination of Abraham Lincoln an unspeakable calamity for African Americans. Uh, and you also have folks in the South, right, who fear that that yes, that this incident will lead to retribution, but also that maybe the South has lost its best friend. Right, this is a view that would be put forth, I think, kind of most famously in D.W. Griffith's 12 Reel Racist epic, Birth of a Nation, 1915. The opening sequence of that film is a recreation, a very elaborate recreation of Lincoln's assassination. And one of the title cards in that film says, "The South has lost its best friend." Right? We would have gotten a better deal, a better peace under Lincoln. And so there's a lot of fear in the South, right? Of what does this mean? Is this new and more openly vengeful Andrew Johnson? What does that portend for us? So widespread mourning. Of course, Lincoln has a state funeral in the East Room of the White House, lies in state at the Capitol building. African American soldiers, USCT soldiers, are going to march in his funeral procession in Washington, and then he is loaded onto a funeral train that makes a circuitous route through the North, stopping making stops, and there is the route, right? 20 days, 20-day route back to Springfield, and public ceremonials in many of these towns: Albany, Schenectady, Buffalo, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Chicago. Until he's finally laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield in a temporary vault. Um, Public outpourings of grief in all of these towns. Um, the Lincoln funeral is, again, kind of keeps this tragedy alive for the next month. And when those Union soldiers struck down Pennsylvania Avenue at the end of May 1865 in the Grand Review, right, the buildings are still adorned with black mourning crepe, right? The Victory Parade, again, to kind of illustrate that whiplash, that kind of feeling of oscillating between great relief that the war is over and great tragedy and sadness over the loss of the president, right? You got banners celebrating Union victory that are literally being hanged over black mourning crepe. So it's an event unlike any other, the first presidential assassination.
Excellent. And so let's go back to the big chase for John Wilkes Booth, um,
Yes.
if you wouldn't mind. There we go. Explain away.
And there it is.
Yeah.
So Ford's Theater, of course, Lincoln is shot, Act 3, Scene 2, just about 10, 15, 10:20 p.m. That evening. He's going to escape Washington, D.C. Through the Navy Yard Bridge and then make his way to the Mary Surratt's Tavern. Remember, he had directed Mary Surratt to take a package containing a pair of shooting irons and field glasses. She was going to stow that away at her tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland. So he stops by the Surratt Tavern, picks up that package, and then, along with his fellow conspirator Davy Harold, is going to make his way through southern Maryland to the home of Dr. Samuel Alexander Mudd. Again, an enslaver, a Confederate sympathizer, someone who was connected to the Confederate underground in Montreal, someone whom John Wilkes Booth had met with 3 times prior to the night of the assassination. Booth is going to stop at Dr. Mudd's home and ask him to set his fractured leg. Now, Booth at this point is wearing a set of false whiskers, and Samuel Mudd, right, is going to use this to claim that he didn't recognize Booth, that he had no idea, that he was just a country doctor upholding his Hippocratic oath. And that case sort of unraveled, right, as the trial would get underway, right? His descendants, interestingly enough, I mean, they would lead his daughter. Compiled a very sanitized edition of his letters and writings. His grandson, Richard Mudd, lived on well into the 20th century, actually sought a official pardon from President Jimmy Carter. They really insisted that their ancestor was innocent. But more recent scholarship, and the key person here is a guy named Ed Steers. Has written several books on the Lincoln assassination and a biography of Mudd. I mean, Ed Steers, I think, rightly identifies Mudd as the key, not just a conspirator, but the key conspirator who brings the Surratts into the fold, who introduces Booth to other folks who are going to lead him along this escape route. So it's rather implausible that Mudd doesn't recognize this guy that he's met 3 times before. He sets his leg, right, and facilitates a further escape. He will make his way through Zacchaeus Swamp into the pine thicket, again, winding his way through Maryland, basically along a map that he has already drawn of where to find Confederate sympathizers, where to find people who have been linked to his plots. Samuel Cox is another of those folks who helps him along. Finally, there's a 5-night stand in what's called the Pine Thicket. That's the woods that you see right there along the edge of the Potomac. He and Davy Harold will be in the Pine Thicket, and then they are going to get across the Potomac onto the northern neck of Virginia, and out to a place called Garrett's Farm. And there, Booth and Harold will hold themselves up in an old tobacco barn, and this is where the manhunt is going to come to an end. 16th New York Cavalry is dispatched to pursue Booth, to chase Booth and Harold. They are going to surround the Garrett property on April the 26th, and they call on Booth and Harold. They, of course, want to take Booth and Harold alive. Harold will come out. He comes out of the barn and surrenders. Booth does not. They set fire to the barn to try to flush him out. and he refuses to escape. Instead, a member of the 16th New York Cavalry named Boston Corbett, who was a survivor of Andersonville Prison. Boston Corbett is going to fire a shot into the burning barn, and that shot is going to mortally wound John Wilkes Booth, who is then dragged from the barn. His last words, right, as he looks at his hands, he says, "Useless, useless," um, and is going to be mortally wounded by Boston Corbett here at the Garrett Farm, April the 26th, 1865. 12-day manhunt. Again, April 26th. It's the same day that Joe Johnston is capitulating to William Tecumseh Sherman down at Bennett Place in North Carolina. Um, Boston Corbett's bullet is going to spare the nation the satisfaction of a trial for John Wilkes Booth, of course. They take his body back to Washington, D.C. An autopsy is conducted on the USS Montauk in the Washington Navy Yard. The rest of the conspirators are rounded up, and there will be a military trial, very controversially. Not a civilian trial, but a military trial. Again, a reminder that the war is not yet over, that this is seen as an act of war, a military trial for the remaining conspirators. Mary Surratt, right, as the owner of the boarding house where the conspirators met, as the person who was going to stash the shooting irons and the field glasses at her Maryland tavern. She is going to be sentenced to hang, first woman in American history given a sentence to publicly hang. George Atzerodt, of course, for his role in the conspiracy, the assignment to kill Andrew Johnson. He's sentenced to hang. Lewis Payne, Lewis Powell is sentenced to hang, as is Davy Harold, the accomplice who escaped along with John Wilkes Booth. Those four conspirators, and there is the scene on July the 7th, 1865. The scaffold that was erected. It's Winfield Scott Hancock, old commander of the Second Corps, who is going to clap his hands 3 times and call for the trap doors to swing open and the conspirators there to hang. A couple of other folks in the conspiracy scheme. Samuel Alexander Mudd, right? He's sentenced to life imprisonment out at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas off the not terribly far from Key West. Michael O'Laughlin, who had been one of Booth's associates in Baltimore, involved in the kidnap plot, he too is given a life sentence, sentenced to life imprisonment at Fort Jefferson. And Edmund Spangler, who was the hapless Ford's Theater stagehand who had kind of set things up for Booth, had arranged for Joseph Burroughs to hold the horse. He too is sentenced to life imprisonment out at Fort Jefferson. The only member of the conspiracy who really kind of escapes and gets away is Mary Surratt's son, John Harrison Surratt, who, interestingly enough, makes his way across the pond and finds his way into the Papal Guard, is finally arrested years later, has a civilian trial, and it's a hung jury, and he escapes any sort of punishment. Samuel Alexander Mudd, interestingly enough, there was a yellow fever outbreak in 1867 across much of the South. that yellow fever outbreak is going to take the life of Michael O'Loughlin in prison. But because Samuel Alexander Mudd puts his medical expertise to use in that prison, he is going to earn for himself a commutation of his sentence from Andrew Johnson, of course, who was used and wielded the pardon power pretty freewheelingly in his administration, and that pardon, right, sets off the controversy over whether he was really innocent or not. Again, most historians believing that probably not. That's the fate of the Lincoln conspirators. But this remarkable scene here, July 7th. And a remarkable trial, right, that's held there, known as the Hunter Commission. David Hunter, famous commander from Shenandoah Valley, is going to preside over that trial, collecting testimony from more than 350 witnesses. They worked almost nonstop. They took only one short recess, and that was to allow folks to watch the grand review, that victory parade, and then it was right back to work. Lots of controversy at the time over whether it should be a civilian trial or a military commission, but of course, a reminder that the war wasn't over and that this was very much seen as an act of war. Some people feeling that the investigation didn't go far enough, that if they had gone even farther, they would have been able to implicate Confederates. And then, of course, as the pendulum of the historiography swings back the other way, right, folks saying, well, it was too vengeful and it went too far. And folks also talking about the alleged innocence of Mary Surratt. And, so back and forth the pendulum swings. But now we have the benefit of having several very good published editions of all of the evidence collected by the Hunter Commission. Ed Steers, again, kind of a key figure in this historiography, is you can still find on the used book market a very thick volume of all of the evidence collected. So lots of good scholarship yet to be done on the trial and on the investigation. And certainly a couple of years later, Ben Butler is going to launch what really is the 19th century's version of the Warren Commission. He launches yet another government investigation into the conspiracy, into investigation, and of course, nothing attracts conspiracy theorists and half-baked hunches quite like a presidential assassination, as we know.
Excellent. And I must ask, when's the book coming out? I'm fancy joking.
So I
have to think about it.
Yes, I am under contract to do a entry in the Emerging Civil War series on the Lincoln assassination. So
brilliant.
Forthcoming.
Excellent. Yeah, I was going to make a joke about that, but you're doing it. So excellent. Yeah. I was going to say to Chris, come on, mate. Look, this guy knows what he's talking about. But absolutely brilliant, Brian. I could listen to you all day long. And all that is left to say is I hope you enjoyed this podcast, ladies and gentlemen, and cheers.